It's Sunday, April 28th, 2024, around 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. You're watching Co-op for Two, and we are continuing our reading of A Study in Scarlet, a Sherlock Holmes consulting detective murder mystery dossier. It's basically a retelling of Arthur Conan Doyle's first novel about Sherlock Holmes. And this is our second session. We're going to do a little bit of a recap and then we'll get into it. We'll probably go for 2 hours today, I guess. If you haven't watched the first session, which was last Sunday at 3 p.m., this won't make any sense. It'll be best if you stopped watching and watched that. And if you know the novel, A Study in Scarlet, you'll know the answer to this. This is not a new mystery. It's not based on, it's not a different solution. It is a retelling of A Study in Scarlet with facsimile documents. And you can see it's quite beautifully done. And we've been enjoying the historical context of all this. And for me, someone who never read the original, it's quite fascinating to basically be seeing an origin story of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes's origin. This is the story that introduces us to Watson and Holmes, and it's been quite engaging and feels real. Feels like this is real historical stuff. All right, let's check in with the chat and do a little bookkeeping before we get started. On Thursday, a couple people joined me for a playthrough of the latest Deadbolt Mystery Society box called The Comic Book Killer. Definitely some high points, some low points. My frustration levels were challenged a bit, but we did get through it. And we've been playing the Seventh Citadel about 30 hours worth so far. We're about at the halfway point of the first threat. I'm loving the game. I'm just waiting on Jonathan Warner to let me know when a good time is to schedule more playthroughs. What else? I want to thank all of the Patreon supporters of this channel. There's a thread on Board Game Geek that I noticed today talking about YouTube channels that have been going for years, that have very little subscribers, that don't have promotional deals, don't get free copies of games. And whenever I see that, I think how lucky I am that this channel is such a source of enjoyment and that we don't have to mess with any of that stuff. I don't feel any conflict of interest. I don't feel like we're beholden to anyone. And the freedom of being able to just do the channel and enjoy playing these games and talking together is worth its weight in gold. What else should we talk about? I did want to talk a little bit about the historical basis for Watson's service, military service in Afghanistan. It was one of the questions I had during the channel. I didn't really understand the context, and I do want to talk about that a little bit. A couple more things first, though. So on Tuesday, we'll be playing one of the classic Sherlock Holmes consulting detective cases, proper games, from the West End Adventures. You can see that green box on the shelf there is the original, one of the older original copies of that set of 6 cases. It's not clear, I haven't decided yet whether we'll play the case from the new box, the new Space Cowboys box, or the original. I was looking back at our playthrough of the first 2 cases from this set, and we actually did play the Space Cowboys set. So probably we'll be playing the Space Cowboys case 3, but maybe we'll be comparing a little bit old versus new, look at the changes. Some of the expansions, it's become clear as we've played them on the channel, the originals were better. But I think maybe West End Adventures and the original Thames Murders box, they may be better in the Space Cowboys versions. Okay, what else should we catch up on? I did just purchase a used copy of Lovely City Season 2 for us to play on the channel. If you'll remember, we played Season 1, which was the Independence Day Killer here on the channel, over 6 sessions, about 30 hours. And this channel, I love the long games that take multiple sessions, and there are a bunch of people who join me on this channel to play through them that like them as well. And Season 2 is another one just as long, I believe, as Season 1, which is about 6 boxes. And it's one of the ones that I've been trying to get my hands on for a while. It's still in print. It's just very expensive, new. It's over $200. And so I picked up a used copy for $135. Again, thanks to the Patreon supporters that are making it a little easier to make these purchases. But we have a lot of games piling up that we have to get through, and I do want to play Body of Evidence soon. So anyway, we've got a lot to get through. All right, so let's do a little bit of recap. I think the way to do it is just to flip through this till I get to where we left off and just summarize what we've got here. So basically, this whole dossier is being pitched as the author of this, the person who created this, the credited author of this dossier. It's sort of like pretending that he's discovered the works of Watson and he's trying to get it published. And then we get introduced to Watson. We hear about his military service in Afghanistan, how he was a surgeon, wounded, sent home. 1880s newspapers about the wars in Afghanistan, little map of the military battle in Afghanistan, and some military journal snippets. These are basically Watson's notes. His diary, having come home from the war, and he's basically staying in hotels, going out drinking, and the hotel is writing him saying, you know, you're fun, you haven't been paying your bill in time, you've got a dog, time to pay your bills. And we're told that in Watson's notes, which we're reading through, occasionally Sherlock Holmes has made some annotations. So it's not always clear when it's Holmes writing annotations, but, and then we've got more of Watson's diaries. So let's talk for a second. A couple people wrote to me by email or let me know in Discord a little bit more of the background about Afghanistan. So the question I had when we're reading this is, why are the British in Afghanistan? This is in the 1870s, 1880s, I guess. And to make a long story short, as I understand it, it's basically the British Empire were concerned about the Russians, the Russian Empire, fighting for dominance in all of these countries where the British had colonies, where the British were ruling. And I think my understanding is that the British colonies in India, the British they were fighting over Afghanistan as the sort of buffer zone between Russia and India. So I guess Afghanistan was also a colony, is that right? But mainly they were fighting in Afghanistan to keep Russian influence out of India, out of British-controlled India. Okay, so more diaries from Watson, talking about being back in London, going to his old haunts, meeting his old friends, and he runs into someone who's skipping out on his bills that he goes drinking, but the person he runs into tells him about a friend of his named Holmes, who's also looking for a new place to live, because Watson has to find a new place to live that's not as expensive as the hotels. So this person matchmakes the two of them, and we have a very funny scene where Watson is sort of bluffs his way into sharing an apartment with Watson. It was really quite fun. What was the... So he gets introduced to Holmes, who's doing some experiments on blood, of this very eccentric person. And so they're talking about... Let's just take a look at this again, because this was such a fun scene. Stamford, this is the mutual friend, brought up the idea of the two of them living together. Holmes was interested, to my surprise, for by now I thought he must be as suspicious of myself as I was of him. He mentioned a suite in Baker Street, which he had seen, and then cross-examined me with the apparent intention of putting me off. Irresistibly, I found myself rising to the challenge of this awkward fellow and matching him squarely. He said he smoked strong tobacco, and I told him I smoked ships myself, which I knew to be the strongest stuff obtainable. He pretended not to mind and countered with talk of his chemicals and experiments lasting throughout the night. This was easy for me to dismiss, since my profession is quite accustomed to such things. Far from annoying me, I said with satisfaction, this would amuse me greatly. So that he's having this little challenging moment with Holmes. This reminds me of a little bit of Oscar Wilde kind of humor. And he finds himself, before he knows it, convincing Holmes that they would do well to share an apartment. And before he knows it, he's found himself agreeing with Holmes, talking about the violent, agreeing with Holmes to share an apartment. As we walked back to my hotel, I could not resist asking how Holmes might have guessed I'd... Oh, then there's this little thing about how did Holmes guess that he was in Afghanistan? We're sort of seeing the novel from different perspective. Okay, and then we get more of Watson's diaries of having actually moved into 221 Baker Street with Holmes. And Holmes is a bit of a mystery to him. We get this map of London that we might want to put aside because he's marked up places in it. Now, we're used to playing Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, where we're just seeing a piece of this map. But essentially, if you look, there's 221 Baker Street, 221B Baker Street, and then he's marked some other places in London. Bar he goes, hotel he stayed at. But that's where their apartment is. It's the origin story of 221B Baker Street as well. More diary and letter entries from Watson about Holmes and how curious he is and peculiar he is. He has this whole discussion about how Holmes has this very eccentric, very broad set of knowledge, but eccentric. And there's this funny thing here about how Holmes has no idea anything about how the Earth revolves around the sun. And there's this talk, and he says, I began to think this when he denied all knowledge of the Copernican theory and how of the composition of the solar system. I did not believe anyone in the second half of the 19th century should not be aware that the Earth travels around the sun, but Holmes did not seem to care at all if I thought him the most ignorant man in the world. He made a point of telling me that he would do his best to forget what I had just told him. He will accept no advice but his own, and seems to have no appreciation of the importance of a proper understanding of the solar system. And then Holmes has actually written a little annotation here, a little note as he was reading this. He says, what difference does it make to me if the sun goes around the Earth or the Earth goes around the sun? And he talks about how he has to push stuff out of his mind that's not relevant. And then, in fact, at some point, Watson out of his curiosity, has made a list of what Holmes knows. He's got no knowledge of literature, no knowledge of philosophy, astronomy, feeble knowledge of politics, a little bit of botany, a little bit of geology, profound knowledge of chemistry, a bit of anatomy, and immense knowledge of sensational literature. Basically, he knows about previous crimes. A lot of knowledge of British law. So quite a fun thing. Okay, and then we've got this little thing written by Holmes talking about how don't let stuff into your brain that you don't need. And I think maybe he talks about here about don't jump to conclusions, just gather evidence, or somewhere else. Watson reads this. Watson finds this, reads it, says it's total dreck, and then it turns out that Holmes was the author of it. And then Watson wants to know about how Holmes had figured out he was from Afghanistan. Holmes explains how he deduced it based on his limp and all that stuff. Watson can't quite believe it, but he thinks maybe it's an act. Maybe he set it up, but maybe he figured it out. And then he tests him on some guy walking across the street who brings an envelope. And Holmes does it again. Seizing my opportunity to catch Holmes out, I asked the man what his trade was. Oh, here, because he's asked Holmes to try to test him. This guy walking across the street. And Watson says, you're kind of reminding me of Edgar Allan Poe's fictional detective, one of the first detective stories. And Holmes says he's a bungler. And Watson is indignant, having two characters whom I admired treated in this cavalier style. And then, let's see. The guy comes to knock on the door with the envelope, a delivery guy, and Watson sees an opportunity to catch out Holmes by asking him what the guy did, and then Holmes had figured it out completely, and then Watson thinks this was probably a setup. And then he asks him how, and he figures it out. Okay. So here's the letter that gets delivered to Holmes. And it's from Scotland Yard talking about a murder. Some details. The guy was found, Enoch Dryber or something, from Cleveland, Ohio. No robberies in this abandoned house. No wounds. There are marks of blood, but no wound. And Tobias Gregson, one of the Scotland Yard people, says they need Holmes's help. Watson gets excited about finally sort of getting in on what Holmes has been doing lately. And Holmes decides to take him along. They get in the cab. They head over to this apartment. And this is where we stopped after reading this scene. So I think we'll read this scene again to give us a second listen to the scene of the crime, scene of the murder, before we start with new documents. Okay, here it is. Friday, 4th of March. Gregson's note to Holmes stirred me. Well, before I start here, let me just check in with the chat. Is there anything that we haven't caught up on? Anything that I'm leaving out? I mean, they're the details of the scene, but I'm going to completely reread them now. Okay, let's reread them. Gregson's note to Holmes stirred me to great excitement, but Holmes was infuriatingly offhand about the whole business. He rambled on about Gregson and Lestrade being the pick of a bad lot of Scotland Yard detectives, and obtained much amusement from telling me what fun there would be if they were both put on the same case. for they were apparently as jealous of each other as a pair of professional beauties. Offered to run for a cab. Okay, so they get the cab, and Holmes doesn't want to do it. Let's see. I offered to run for a cab, but he seemed wholly indifferent to any sense of urgency. When I protested that this was just the sort of case he had been waiting for, he said that even if he did unravel the whole matter, Gregson and Lestrade would pocket all the credit and would never admit that Holmes had bested them, though they knew well enough that his skill was superior to theirs. I guessed his diffidence was an act to impress me, for he suddenly changed his mind on the excuse that it would amuse him to beat them at their own game. So here we see Holmes doesn't like not getting the credit, and this is why this is also the kickoff of the origin story, because now Watson is going to start telling his stories. Okay, so all of a sudden he changes his mind. He seized his overcoat, told me to come with him, and in a minute we were both in a hansom headed for the Brixton Road. It was morning, just such as that described in the adventure story I was reading, a foggy, cloudy morning. Holmes seemed not to have a thought for our business. And then this is Holmes' annotations here. It is a capital mistake to theorize before you have all the evidence. It biases the judgment. This is the one piece of advice from Holmes that I've talked about many times that we do not follow in this channel. We like to theorize constantly. It's more fun, but it's not to say that Holmes doesn't have the better strategy. Okay, I must admit I was feeling pretty melancholy. I had thought to have left my share of violence behind me in Afghanistan, but Holmes was unperturbed until I pointed out that we must be near the house. The wretched fellow insisted we alight from the cab while we were still 100 yards away. Number 3, Lauriston Gardens, was one of 4 grim-looking houses which stood back from the street. 2 were occupied, but 2 were empty, and a number of to let cards were stuck on several of the windows on all 3 levels. Keep in mind, remember that this was written 130 years ago. It's pretty astounding to think we're reading something written 130 years ago. There's a small garden in front of each house with some sickly plants and a narrow pathway of clay and gravel made sloppy by last night's rain. A 3-foot brick wall topped by wooden rails bounded each garden. A policeman was leaning against the wall, keeping at bay a prying crowd of loafers. Holmes maintained his affected air of nonchalance, gazed vacantly at the pavement, sauntered along the grass beside the path, staring at the ground. He stopped twice, smiled, and uttered an exclamation of satisfaction. Since there were a great many footsteps on the path, including those of the police, I could not see how he could hope to learn anything from this scrutiny. And then Holmes has written, my perceptive faculties enabled me to see much that is hidden from you. Gregson greeted us warmly at the door. He was tall, white-faced, flaxen-haired man with a notebook in his hand. Holmes at once upbraided him for allowing the police to walk all over the path, but Gregson quickly shifted the blame onto Lestrade, who was there as well. Holmes teased Gregson that with 2 such men on the ground, there would not be much for a third party to find out. Gregson took the remark at face value, said with pride he had done all that could be done. He admitted it was a queer case and had known Holmes's taste for such things, which was why he had asked him along. Holmes asked if either man had come by cab. Gregson looked puzzled and said they had not. We then entered the house by a short passage, bare planked and dusty, and turned into a large square room, completely bare of furniture. The wallpaper was blotched in places with mildew, peeling to expose yellow plaster beneath. It was the dining room, he says. Vulgar and something. Opposite the door was a showy fireplace with a mantelpiece of imitation white marble. On one corner of this was stuck the stump of a red wax candle. The solitary window was so dirty that the light was hazy and uncertain, giving a dull gray tinge to everything, which was intensified by the thick layer of dust which coated the whole apartment. The body was lying stretched out and face upwards on the boards. It was that of a man in his early 40s, middle-sized, broad-shouldered, with tightly curled black hair and a short, stubbly beard. He was dressed in a heavy broadcloth frock coat and waistcoat, with light-colored trousers, immaculate collar and cuffs. A top hat, well brushed and trim, was placed upon the floor beside him. His hands were clenched and his arms thrown abroad, while his lower limbs were interlocked, as though his death struggle had been a grievous one. On his rigid face there stood an expression of horror, and, as it seemed to me, of hatred, such as I have never seen upon human features. This malignant and terrible contortion, combined with the low forehead, blunt nose, and prognathous jaw, gave the dead man a singularly simious and ape-like appearance, which was increased by his writhing, unnatural posture. I have seen death in many forms, but never has it appeared to me in a more fearsome aspect than in that dark, grimy apartment, which looked out upon one of the main arteries of suburban London. And Holmes has written a little note here: avoid sensationalism. You don't need to be so horrid. Holmes pointed to the blood stains around the body, asked if the detectives were sure there was no wound. Both were positive. Holmes then made much of stating that the blood came from someone else, possibly the murderer, which seemed pretty obvious. He examined the dead man swiftly, sniffed his lips, glanced at the soles of his patent leather boots, asked if he had been moved, and when told no more than necessary, advised Gregson to remove the body. As it was being raised, a ring tinkled down and rolled across the floor. Lestrade grabbed it and declared it to be a plain gold woman's wedding ring. Gregson exclaimed that this made matters even more complicated than they were before, but Holmes said it made things simpler. Both men stared at him blankly. He did not explain. He asked to see the contents of the dead man's pockets. Gregson showed him a litter of objects on the stairs and handed him a list of items. And what have we got? He says, compare von something something. There is nothing new under the sun. It has all been done before. So this is a note about a previous case. Sure seems like poisoning, but I don't know what the deal is with what he's discovered from the soles of the shoes, etc. He was convinced there had been a woman in the house. Okay, so there's a litter of objects on the stairs, handed him a list. Okay, so we don't know what that is yet. This is where we left off. Rob says there is a photo of the body. Okay, let's take a look at the items, though. We've got the ring that was found, plain gold wedding ring. I guess we did look a little further because at some point we're given the business card of Sherlock Holmes, which we have here. It looks like he's made a sketch of the scene. And then we're going to see the business card of the person. Let's take a look at the scene of the crime that he sketched out, though. Watson, this is what I saw at Laniston Gardens. I mean, he was there, so what have we got? There's the body, fireplace with the red candle on the mantle. There's bloodstains on the ground. It looks like he's got some shoe prints of patent leather and what cigar ash. I guess we're going to hear about that in a second. And maybe some other footprints, shoe prints of square-toed. All right, so let's put this aside. Maybe we're going to hear about that now. Okay, so here are the effects that were found. Particulars of occurrence reported by Constable something. Case referred to Detectives Gregson and Lestrade. W Division, 4th of March. Okay, let's see. These are the effects of Eunuch Drever. That's his business card from Cleveland, Ohio. Let's see what they found. Gold Watch 97163 by Beround of London. Gold Albert chain, very heavy and solid. Gold ring with Masonic something. Gold pin with a full clock's head with ruby eyes. A Russian leather card case with cards, Unique Weber, which is Drever, which is this card. Linen handkerchief marked with EJW. EJD. This is the problem I had before. I kept reading this as W, but it's a D. EJD. Okay, so he's got a handkerchief with his monograph. He's got these business cards. He's clearly rich and well off. Loose money, £7.13. Pocket edition of the something furnished by Chatto and Widdis, London, 1874, with the name of Joseph Stanzarion on Fryleaf. So he's got a book owned by someone else. We don't know what this book is, I guess, yet. 2 letters addressed to E.J. Dreber and Joseph Stanzarion, both marked to be left at the American Exchange Strand till called for, both from the Geryon Steamship Company, with reference to the sailing of their boats from Liverpool to New York, Saturday, 5th of March. So the boats are scheduled to go tomorrow. There's this person, he's got his book, he's mentioned several times. We certainly want to talk to him. Then the wedding ring that we've got here. Plain gold wedding ring. Okay, and what has Holmes written here? Note that this is the complete translation with an introduction by Thomas Wright, restoring those passages omitted in former edition. Dreber's Choice or Stangerson's. He's talking about this book here is the full edition of something. Okay, here we go. There's a photo of the body. It says Rob. Okay, I see. There's the contorted face. There's the dingy apartment with the fireplace, the bad wallpaper. There's the blood on the ground. There's the fancy top hat and the contorted face, which makes me think poison. All right. Okay. This says Lariston Gardens, 4th of March, 1881, Unique J. Drever. Now, there was another picture with that. Let's wait to see if we get told about it. Okay, so here is Watson's notes. Friday, 4th March continued. When Holmes had inspected the dead man's effects in the hallway, Gregson informed him with some satisfaction that he had already placed an advertisement for Stangerson in all the evening papers, that one of his men had gone to make inquiries at the American Exchange, and that he had telegraphed Cleveland asking for further information on both Dreber and Stangerson. Holmes at once unsettled the detective by suggesting he had overlooked a crucial point and by asking if he would not care to telegraph again. Gregson was not amused, thinking that Holmes was merely joking at his expense. Lestrade then reappeared from the front room, rubbing his hands in a pompous and self-satisfied manner. He added to Gregson's discomfort by declaring that he had made a discovery of the utmost importance. We followed him back into the room, where he led us to the darkest corner, struck a match on his boot, held it up against the wall to an area where a large piece of paper had peeled off, leaving a yellow square of coarse plastering, and revealed, scrawled in blood-red letters, a single word, Rache, R-A-C-H-E. He had the air of a showman exhibiting his show. He's talking about Lestrade. The little fellow looked to us for congratulations and, with a triumphant glance at Gregson, made it obvious that no one else had thought of searching in that corner. He pointed to the smear of blood that had trickled down the wall and said that the murderer had obviously written it with his or her own blood, thus disposing of any idea of suicide. Gregson was determined not to lose face entirely, but when he asked, with evident disapproval, what the word meant now that Lestrade had found it, his rival bounced back eagerly and claimed that whoever had done it had been disturbed before completing the word Rachel, and that a woman of that name would certainly be found to be involved in the case eventually. Holmes burst out laughing, and then tried to placate the offended detective by giving him the credit for discovering the word. He asked for permission to examine the room more carefully. Okay, let's see. He no doubt observed that had the candle on the mantelpiece nearby been lit at the time of the murder, this corner of the room would have been the brightest instead of the darkest. He accused me of being very smart and clever, but snapped that the old hound was best when all was said and done. Holmes had so far appeared rather casual about everything, but now I was fascinated to watch him work with fierce concentration. He whipped a tape measure and a large round magnifying glass from his pocket, and with these two implements he trotted noiselessly about the room, sometimes stopping, occasionally kneeling, and once lying flat upon his face. So engrossed was he with his occupation that he appeared to have forgotten our presence, for he chattered away to himself under his breath the whole time, keeping up a running fire of exclamations, groans, whistles, and little cries suggestive of encouragement and hope. As I watched him, I was irresistibly reminded of a pure-blooded, well-trained foxhound as it dashes backwards and forwards through the covert, whining in its eagerness until it comes across the lost scent. For 20 minutes or more, he continued his researches, measuring with the most exact care marks which were entirely invisible to me, and occasionally applying his tape to the walls in an equally incomprehensible manner. In one place, he gathered up very carefully a little pile of gray dust from the floor and packed it away in an envelope. Finally, he examined with his glass the word upon the wall, going over every letter of it with the most minute exactness. This done, he appeared to be satisfied, for he replaced his tape and his glass in his pocket. They say that genius is an infinite something for taking pains, a very definition, but it does, a very bad definition, but it does apply to detective work. Genius is an infinite capacity for taking pains. Interesting. That feels like it would match with some of our playthroughs. An infinite capacity for taking pains. Okay. And he says, I did not wish to rob them of any credit, but I was always happy to help them if they needed me. Okay. Gregson and Lestrade asked with curiosity and some contempt what he made of it, and Holmes replied that they were doing so well it would be a pity for anyone to interfere. He took down the name and address of John Rance, the constable who had found the body, and then made a bold statement that the murderer was a man more than 6 feet high, in the prime of life, with small feet for his height, wearing coarse, square-toed boots, and smoking a Trichinopoly cigar. He had come with his victim in a four-wheeled cab, which was drawn by a horse with 3 old shoes and 1 new one on his off foreleg. In all probability, the murderer had a florid face, and the fingernails of his right hand were remarkably long. Neither man believed a word of it, for they shook their heads and smiled at each other. Nor did I, but if it was a bluff, I thought it a very good one. Gregson asked how the murder had been done, and Holmes replied it was poison. To Lestrade, he said, Rach was the German for revenge. So to look for Miss Rachel would be a waste of time. We left both men open-mouthed. Rob says, have you changed the order of documents? In my dossier, the photos and the line paper comes before the list of items. I have not changed the order of anything, so looks like it was just bound differently. Okay, so then we have the photo of the man, which we already saw. And this looks like this is how he's figured out the horses. The horse is wearing a new shoe. He was studying it. There's the cab wheel and the horse wearing with 1 new shoe, I guess. And horseshoe and carriage tracks. So he's also noticed that we've got 2 set of boots. 1 shoes, 1 pointed set of shoes, 1 square-toed set of shoes. If they're leaving tracks in the mud, I guess that means they arrived after the rain. Square toes and pointed shoes. Okay, well that matches 2 sets of shoe prints here. I guess square toes. Okay, so what have we got here? The Guion line. Mr. E.J. Drever, care of the American Exchange, Strand. So was this found on him? I guess this was found on him. Dear sir, in accordance with your request, we have reserved a passage for you on board our regular weekly mail steamer service from Liverpool to New York, sailing from Liverpool on Saturday, 5th of March. For further details of the vessel and time of departure, we beg that you will contact our Pall Mall office. We like to remind our passengers that the service supplies abundant provisions of excellent quality, served and cooked by the company's stewards. We are proud to boast that the Guion line has not lost a single English, Welsh, Scotch, or Irish passenger for the last 25 years. We wish you a very pleasant voyage and respectfully remain yours on behalf of the Guion line. Okay, so notice he's booked this all the way back. Well, not all the way back. He's booked it on 28th of February for the 5th of March. Oh, here's a photo of the word written there. So there's the candle. And there's Rach, or however you pronounce it in German, revenge. And Rob says in his copy, these are bound in a different order. Okay, what have we got here now? Sent to Cleveland. Account of Scotland Yard. Name and address of the sender, Gregson. And he's sending it to Cleveland. So he's inquiring now about this dead body, about this guy. Body identified as Enoch J. Dreber of Cleveland, Ohio, USA. Discovered this morning at 3 Lauriston Gardens, Brixton, London. Stop. Suspected foul play. Stop. Evidence of association with Joseph Stangerson not yet apprehended. Stop. Both men due to take in line Liverpool to New York, leaving Liverpool Saturday, 5th March. Stop. Please telegraph any previous criminal record on Drebber or Stangerson. Stop. Urgent. Stop. Okay. This message is paid for as an ordinary unpacked message. I don't know what that means, an unpacked message. But he's sending a telegram, trying to get information from the Cleveland police. Notice to the public, conditions as to messages to America. They're not accepting any liability if there's any delays. If the message fails. Okay, and then we've got another little piece of writing by Sherlock Holmes. I don't know if these were originally written by Arthur Conan Doyle. Two little monographs. Supposedly written by Sherlock Holmes, 1879 and 1880. Soul impressions. I see. He's got a little treatise on footprints, shoe prints, and ashes. If they're going to be mentioned, I'm just going to put these off for just a couple pages to see if they're mentioned somewhere, and then we'll read them. Okay, Friday, 4th of May continued. We left Lauriston Gardens at 1 o'clock. Holmes sent a long telegram, which he refused to show me, then insisted that we took a cab to 46 Audley Court, Kennington Park Gate, where Constable Rance lived. He wants to talk to the guy who was discovered it, I guess. I asked bluntly whether he was as sure of his facts as he made out, and he at once launched into such a plausible explanation that I felt quite guilty. And then he says, my mind was something, but I thought we might as well obtain some first-hand evidence. My mind was made up. The first thing he said he had observed at Lauriston Gardens was that a cab had made 2 ruts with its wheels close to the curb. Since, up to last night, we had had no rain for a week, those wheels, which left such a deep impression, must have been there during the night. Therefore, it brought the 2 individuals to the house. There were the marks of the horses' hoofs, too, the outline of one of which was far more clearly cut than that of the other 3, showing that there was a new shoe. I have Gregson's word for it that no cab arrived in the morning. I said that was simple enough, but asked about the other man's height. Holmes explained that the height of a man, in 9 cases out of 10, can be told from the length of his stride. This fellow's stride was evident on the clay outside and on the dust within. The calculation could be checked, he said, for when a man writes on a wall, his instinct leads him to write about the level of his own eyes, and that writing was just over 6 feet from the ground. Child's play, says Holmes. A simple calculation, no use for boring you with figures. Now, how about his age, I asked. Holmes replied that if a man could stride 4.5 feet without the slightest effort, he couldn't be quite in the sere and yellow. Don't know what that means. That was the breadth of a puddle on the path which he had evidently walked across. Patent leather boots had gone round, and square toes had hopped over, claimed Holmes. No mystery, simply the application of basic percepts and observation and deduction. Okay, now, the fingernails and the trichinopoly, I said. Holmes answered that the writing on the wall was done with a man's forefinger dipped in blood. His glass had allowed him to observe that the plaster was slightly scratched from doing it, which would not have been the case if the man's nail had been trimmed. He had also gathered up some scattered ash from the floor. It was dark in color and flaky, such as was only made by trichinopoly, said Holmes, who claimed that he could distinguish at a glance the ash of any known brand of either cigar or of tobacco. It is in such details that the skilled detective differs from Gregson and Lestrade. I asked about the florid face, but Holmes admitted that that was more a daring shot and would not answer. The case seemed no less mysterious to me for all his glib replies. How came these two men into an empty house? What became of the cabman who drove them? How could one man compel another to take poison? Where did the blood come from? What was the object of the murderer, since robbery had no part in it? How came the woman's ring there? Above all, why should the second man write up the German word Reich before decamping? Holmes acknowledged that there were still a few obscure points, but believed this last to be merely a ruse to put the police on. Okay, I had no doubt that I was right, said Holmes here. Okay, let's see. Melissa says, does this sound very similar to the male in the Sherlock case, or is it just me, the one with the man that worked with the Japanese investor? Melissa's talking about another recent case that we played with Dear Holmes where there was writing on the wall in blood. Okay, so Holmes thinks the writing on the wall was just a ruse to put the police on the wrong track, for a real German would have printed in Latin characters and not used a clumsy imitation German A. Holmes then put on a rather bad show of diffidence and refused to tell me anything more about his method of working. In case, he said, I concluded that he was a very ordinary individual after all. I did not want him to stop, and since I had already observed that he was as sensitive to flattery on the score of his art than as any girl could be of her beauty, I told him he had brought detection as near an exact science as it ever would be brought in this world. He says, a conjurer gets no credit once he has explained his trick. He flushed with pleasure, told me that patent leathers and square toes had arrived in the same cab and had walked down the path as friendly as possible. Inside, patent leathers stood still while square toes walked up and down, growing more excited, talking all the time and working himself into a fury. Then the tragedy occurred. That was all he knew, said Holmes. But it was a good basis on which to start. The rest is mere surmise and conjecture. He said, I could read this in the dust, the guy walking back and forth. Our cab, meanwhile, passed through dingy byways and stopped outside a narrow passageway. We walked into a paved quadrangle, lined by sordid dwellings, cluttered by dirty children and discolored linen, until we came to the name Rance, engraved on the door of number 46. We were shown into the parlor, and the constable appeared from bed, grumbling that he had made his report at the office. He changed his tune when Holmes started playing with a half-sovereign coin and said he wanted to hear it all from his own lips. I took down everything he said verbatim. So here's the unofficial conversation with Constable Rance. John Rance. I'll tell it ye from the beginning. My time is from 10 at night to 6 in the morning. At 11 there was a fight at the White Hart. But bar that all was quiet enough on the beat. At 1 o'clock it began to rain, and I met Harry Murcher, him who has the Holland Grove beat, and we stood together at the corner of Henrietta Street a-talkin'. Presently, maybe about 2 or a little after, I thought I would take a look round and see that all was right down the Brixton Road. It was precious dirty and lonely. Not a soul did I meet all the way down, though a cab or two went past me. I was a-strolling down, thinking between ourselves how uncommon handy afore a hot gin would be, when suddenly the glint of a light caught my eye in the window of that same house. Now, I knew that them 2 houses in Lauriston Gardens was empty, on account of him that owns them, who won't have the drains seed to, though the very last tenant that what lived in one of them died of typhoid fever. I was knocked all in a heap, therefore, at seeing a light in the window, and I suspected as something was wrong. When I got to the door, then Holmes interrupts, you stopped, and then walked back to the garden gate. What did you do that for? Francis started. Why, that's true, sir, though how you come to know it, heaven only knows. You see, when I got up to the door, it was so still and lonesome that I thought I'd been none the worse for someone with me. I ain't afeard of anything on this side of the grave, but I thought maybe it was him that died of the typhoid inspecting the drains what killed him. The thought gave me a kind of turn, and I walked back to the gate to see if I could see Murcher's lantern. But there wasn't no sign of him nor of anyone else. And Holmes says, there was no one in the street. Not a living soul, sir, not as much as a dog. Then I pulled myself together and went back and pushed the door open. All was quiet inside, so I went into the room where the light was a-burning. There was a candle flickering on the mantelpiece, a red wax one, and by its light I saw, yes, I know all that you saw. You walked around the room several times, and you knelt down by the body. And then you walked through and tried the kitchen door, and then Rance springs up. Where was you hid to see all that? It seems to me you know a deal more than you should. Then Holmes laughs and says, don't go arresting me for murder. I'm one of the hounds and not the wolf. Mr. Gregson or Mr. Lestrade will answer for that. Go on, though. What did you do next? Then Rance sits down, mystified. I went back to the gate and sounded my whistle, and that brought Murcher and 2 more to the spot. And was the street empty then? Well, it was, as far as anybody that could be of any good goes. Holmes says, what do you mean? Well, I seen many a drunk chap in my time, but never anyone so crying drunk as that cove. He was at the gate when I came out of, leaning up again the railings and a-singing at the pitch of his lungs about Columbine's new-fangled banner or some such stuff he couldn't stand, far less help. Holmes says, what sort of man was he? He was an uncommon drunk sort of man. He had found himself in the station if he hadn't been so took up. Holmes says, his face, his dress, didn't you notice them? I should think I did notice them, seeing that I had to prop him up, me and Murcher between us. He was a long chap with a red face, the lower part muffled round, and then Holmes is exasperated. That will do. What became of him? Well, we'd enough to do without looking after him. I'll wager he found his way home all right. How was he dressed? A brown overcoat. Had he a whip in his hand? A whip? No. Well, he must have left it behind. You didn't happen to see or hear a cab after that? No. Interesting. So they found him drunk, but Holmes thinks he's involved with it. What? That he's the cab driver? Holmes handed the constable the half-sovereign and told him how much is a half-sovereign worth. Told him that he would never rise in the force and that his head should be for use as well as an ornament. He might have gained his sergeant's stripes last night, said Holmes, for the man he held in his hands was the man who holds the clue of this mystery and whom we are seeking. There was no use arguing about it. I told him it was so. We left our informant thoroughly perplexed. Holmes was very angry that the man had missed his one bit of luck, and I said that I was rather surprised that the criminal, who fitted Holmes' description so well, had returned to the scene of the crime. Holmes said it was the ring for which he had come back, and he bet 2-1 he'd catch the man by using the ring for bait. I was rather pleased when he thanked me for persuading him to respond to Gregson's call, especially when he said that he might otherwise have missed one of the finest studies he'd ever come across. A study in Scarlet, he called it, musing on the scarlet thread of murder that runs through the colorless skein of life. And then he says a little art jargon. Our duty is to unravel it and something it and every inch of it. Holmes then became more positive and began to look forward to a Norman Neruda concert he was attending in the afternoon. I was suspicious of this because I knew that these popular concerts were only on Mondays and Saturdays. He leaned back in the cab and started singing a little tune that went something like tra-la-la, lira, lira, lay, but I may have got it wrong. So we returned to Mrs. Hudson's lunch at Baker Street. Let's see. Her attack and his bowing are splendid. Tell me about this concert. The tune was Chopin, and you have got it wrong. This was a special rehearsal for the last performance of the season, Holmes has written. Okay. All right. Why don't we take our break here? We'll come back and we'll continue reading the police report. I'll see you in 8 minutes. Okay, we're back. We're almost at the halfway point. I think maybe we'll finish this in fewer sessions than we thought. So I was reminded in the chat that I need to read these monographs from Sherlock Holmes. So let's read what he says about soul impressions. The tracing of footsteps with some remarks upon the use of plaster of Paris as a preserver of impressions, of impresses. Okay. So this is Sherlock Holmes's amateur forensics. It is the intention of this small paper to put forward certain suggestions for the improvement of police methods in the identification and casting of footprints to provide official detectives with information which may enable them to draw their own comparisons and deductions. I do not expect to change their methods quickly. The average police constable shows little regard for the valuable information in the pursuit of a criminal that can be gained from preserving and studying an impression. I have seen innumerable cases in which qualified detectives have made comparisons of footprints by placing their boot or shoe over the footmark which has been discovered, thus obliterating it, rather than making a new impression by the side of the original. The use of plaster of Paris is generally recommended by the police for the taking of impressions, but this is not a satisfactory method. Such impressions are often too rough and coarse to be of much service. Casts are practically useless as evidence unless they faithfully correspond with the object modeled. A mere similarity in the sole of a boot or shoe with a footmark is of little or no value in evidence. A striking peculiarity must be detected to render such resemblance valid, such as the loss of a nail or nails, of a plate or a piece of a plate, or some other peculiarity or corresponding irregularity which may identify beyond a doubt the footmarks with the boots or shoes compared with them. I've already suggested to a police advisor who is himself an inventor, Dr. Moss, the use of a new composition which will give easily and accurately models of such impressions in their finest detail. This preparation consists of resin mixed with a wax or paraffin in suitable proportions, whereby is obtained at a small cost a compound which becomes quite fluid at temperature below the boiling point of water, and which becomes hard and tough on cooling, and may without injury to the impression be washed clean from adhering foreign matter with water. I have no doubt Dr. Moss will take credit for the use of this composition, but I believe it will take 10 or 15 years for the process to be accepted officially by the police. I would venture to suggest that even in the last 2 or 3 years of this century, the average constable's pocketbook will still contain instructions for the use of plaster of Paris. Far from considering myself to be an outraged victim of the plagiarist, I would be well satisfied if the police would draw up a paper of their own based verbatim on some of the ideas expressed in this monograph. Imitation is a singular form of flattery. He's very concerned with getting credit for this stuff, as would I be. It is noteworthy that this composition will also facilitate the taking of casts of a track found from inclined ground. I have watched on countless occasions the long face of a constable or detective observing his plaster of Paris pouring out of the lower end of the print when he is not taking care to ridge that end with clay. Using the composition, the print can be filled by degrees, and the mixture in the lower end of the print will cool quickly, allowing more to be added to fill the upper end. Further to these matters, a major concern of this monograph is to introduce to the police some concept of the stride pattern that can be deduced from footprints, and the further deduction that can be made from this. Not only can a man's height be ascertained from the length of his stride, but also his weight and state of health. Okay. And now we've got a little monograph on ashes. The distinction between the ashes of the various tobaccos, in which 140 forms of cigar, cigarette, and pipe tobacco are enumerated with color plates illustrating the difference in the ash. Let's see what we've got. Abstract. Tables of cigar, cigarette, pipe tobaccos with analysis of resultant ash of each type, its color, texture, and odor, characteristic behavior of individuals interpreted through the paraphernalia and residue of their smoking habits, analysis of lung strength with reflection on physical condition as determined by the length of cigar ash with reference to the durability and burning speed of a range of tobaccos, analysis of cigar and cigarette stubs with particular reference to saliva and inferences therefrom, analysis of individual character from teeth marks in pipe stems, with further reference to the age and health of the smoker and variety of habits. Current trends are examined in popular smoking habits and in fashionable attitudes to cigars and cigarettes. Analysis of the latest record of the smoking habits of the populace in the recent decade. Over half the tobacco smoked in our towns being in the form of cigars. Reference to importer's list of 1870 showing more than 66 different sizes and brands of cigar, excluding Bengal cheroots or the much cheaper 1D cigars. That's cost 1D. That's a portion of a penny, portion of a pence. Popular fads and the effects on cigars. Belief that the lightest color, claro, is necessarily the mildest, whereas it is the least mature. Effect of this belief on manufacturers who now use light wrappers, almost to the complete exclusion of the darker, more mature ones. Fog's eye, pole sweat, cutworms, and cigarette beetle diseases of tobacco, prevalent in certain areas of the world, and the effects of treatment identifiable in the cigar and cigarettes manufactured from these areas. A review of the areas of tobacco growing throughout the world, particular emphasis on certain lesser-known idiosyncrasies, variations of regional types of Turkish tobacco used in the Hubble Bubble. Variations imposed by the use of different species of evergreen oaks when burning their leafy branches. Talking about different cigars and materials from different countries. Tobacco industry in Sumatra, better suited to wrappers than filler. Assessment of weight of bales, particular weight variation. Cultivation of tobacco in Bombay, Madras, and the Punjab. Suggestions for use of American experts. And then he's got this thing about the Trichinopoli area of Madras, presidency and inferior quality of some of the tobacco from that area, and in consequence of the poor conditions of the soil, suggestion for the development of tobacco industry, soil conditions. What is he making suggestions of how to improve the cigars? Okay. He's just adding his little knowledge to some suggestions. Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Hartford, Connecticut, detailed analysis of less abundant elements of plant nutrients used in test plots of tobacco in these areas. Initial testing having proved elementary and inadequate, it is recommended that they be retaken officially at regular intervals. It is to be hoped that there will be no great delay in this research. Okay, kind of crazy. All right, now what have we got? Police report, 4th of March. This is the police report of this incident. Number 3, Warrington Gardens, Brixton. Constable Rance was not a witness. No witnesses. What does he say? This is his story. Remember, he told us his story, but here's his written report. Went on the beat at 10 o'clock. Nighttime, broke up a fight without resistance at the White Flower. Some public house at 11. That's a bar. Exchanged unimportant information with Constable Mercher at 1 o'clock. Began to rain shortly after 2 o'clock. Alerted by light in window of number 3 Warrington Gardens, known to be an empty house. Entered immediately. So he's leaving out the part of where he got scared. Entered immediately and discovered unattended candle burning in the something room, front room. Observed body of man lying on the floor. Confirmed that gentleman was deceased. checked for other persons, went directly to the road, sounded the whistle, Constable so-and-so, and two others answered my call. No suspicious persons found on premises or in immediate vicinity. Handed over the case to Detectives Gregson and Lestrade. So he's left out the whole thing about the drunk guy that they saw. And it wasn't clear to me whether Holmes thinks he was really drunk or pretending to be drunk. Did anyone get an impression of that? Oh boy, so this is police booklet that Sherlock Holmes owns. Instruction book for the use of candidates and constables. 1871. The object of this little book is to give the candidates on the preparatory class and inexperienced constables some information respecting the service they are entering, and to point out in easy and simple language a few general rules for their guidance. Police orders issued from time to time on very many subjects are voluminous and extensive, and it is well that the young beginner should not be distracted by attempting to grasp too much at one time. So perhaps become alarmed at all that he may suppose is required of him, but rather that he should read the following pages as the first lessons and advice, which he can easily understand, and if he follows them strictly, he may rest assured he will meet few difficulties he cannot readily surmount. When called upon by a person to take another person into custody, he must be guided in great measure by the circumstances of the case, such as the position in life of the accuser and the accused, and the nature of the charge or offense. But if he has any doubt as to how he ought to act, the safest course is to ask all the persons concerned to go with him to the station, where the inspector will hear and determine whether the charge is to be entered or not, and the responsibility is then taken off the constable. Perfect command of temper is indispensable. A man must not allow himself to be moved or excited by any language or threats, however violent. The cooler he keeps himself, the more power he will have over his assailants. Idle or silly remarks are unworthy of notice, and if the persons making them see that they have no effect upon the constable, they will soon leave off. In apprehending a person and making him or her a prisoner, no more violence is to be used than is absolutely necessary for the safe custody of the prisoner. The usual plan is to take hold of the arm and to keep hold until the prisoner is in the station. If a prisoner resists, the constable is bound to struggle with him and overpower him, but not injure him unnecessarily. If the constable is likely to be overpowered, he may draw his truncheon and use it, taking care to avoid striking anyone on the head. The arms and legs should be aimed at to disable a prisoner as parts of the frame least likely to suffer serious injury. He may also spring his rattle, which will bring assistance. These extreme measures are not to be resorted to except in extreme cases when all other attempts have failed and a prisoner is likely to escape through the constable being ill-used and overpowered. In such cases as the following, a constable must act with energy, promptness, and determination, for if he wavers or doubts, the thief may escape or the opportunity to render assistance may be lost. If a felony has been committed and the thief is seen, he must at once be apprehended. Or if the constable receives information that a serious crime has been or is about to be committed, he must go at once to the spot and prevent violence or apprehend the offender if the crime is committed. If an accident occurs and any person is injured or insensible, he must send someone, and that's where it ends. Okay. All right. Here we have now Watson continuing his diary, still the same day, March 4th. Our morning's exertions had been too much for my weak health, and I was tired out in the afternoon. After Holmes's departure for the concert, I lay down upon the sofa and endeavored to get a couple hours' sleep. It was a useless attempt. My mind had been too much excited by all that had occurred, and the strangest fancies and surmises crowded into it. Every time that I closed my eyes, I saw before me the distorted baboon-like countenance of the murdered man. So sinister was the impression which that face had produced upon me that I found it difficult to feel anything but gratitude for him who had removed its owner from the world. If ever human features bespoke vice of the most malignant type, they were certainly those of Enoch J. Drebber of Cleveland. Still, justice must be done. The more I thought of it, the more extraordinary did my companion's hypothesis. Watson has written, the more I thought of it, the more absurd did my companion's hypothesis. And Holmes has crossed out absurd and put extraordinary. In my companion's hypothesis that the man had been poisoned appear, I remember how he had sniffed his lips and had no doubt he had detected something which had given rise to the idea. Then again, if not poison, what had caused the man's death? Since there was neither wound nor marks of strangulation. But, on the other hand, whose blood was that which lay so thickly upon the floor? There were no signs of a struggle, nor had the victim any weapon with which he might have wounded an antagonist. As long as all these questions were unsolved, sleep was no easy matter for me and should not be for Holmes. Not so, writes Holmes. I had already formed a theory which explained all the facts. Okay, continuing. He was very late in returning, so late that I knew that the concert could not have detained him all the time. Dinner was on the table before he appeared, but the first thing he was anxious to do was tell me how magnificent the music had been. He was full of some rather broad nonsense about Darwin's claim that the power of producing and appreciating music existed among the human race long before the power of speech was arrived at. Holmes suggested that was the reason why we are so subtly influenced by music, but I told him that this meant very little to me. One's ideas must be as broad as nature if they are to interpret nature. And he says those are vague memories there are very vague memories in our souls of those misty centuries when the world was in its childhood. Holmes brought the subject back to Brixton and suggested that the affair was upsetting me. I said that it was, but then I thought it as well to remind him how I had seen my own comrades hacked to pieces in Maiwand without losing my nerve during the Afghan War. I think he took my point because he began to talk about mystery stimulating the imagination, which seemed to show that he appreciated my relish for the curious and the unconventional. Where there is no imagination, there is no honor. Then he passed me the evening paper and showed me an account of the affair, pointing out that it did not mention the fact that when the man was raised up, a woman's wedding ring had fallen on the floor. He seemed to think this omission was just as well. And he drew my attention to an advertisement which directed anyone who had lost a wedding ring in the Brixton Road to apply to Dr. Watson at 221B Baker Street. He apologized for using my name and explained that if he had used his own, some dunderheads would recognize it and want to meddle in the affair. I said that I had no ring, and he handed me a perfect facsimile. I asked whom he expected to answer the advertisement, and he said, the man in the brown coat. Our florid friend with square toes, he called him, or some accomplice. I suggested that the man might think it rather dangerous, but Holmes explained that if his view of the case was correct, the fellow would rather risk anything than lose the ring. He outlined his reasoning. I had already every reason to think that it was. According to Holmes, the fellow dropped the ring while stooping over Drebber's body and did not miss it at the time. After leaving the house, he discovered his loss and hurried back, but found the police already in possession. Owing to his own folly in leaving the candle burning, he had to pretend to be drunk in order to allay the suspicions which might have been aroused by his appearance at the gate. Now, put yourself in that man's place, said Holmes. On thinking the matter over, it must have occurred to him that it was possible he had lost the ring in the road after leaving the house. What would he do then? He would eagerly look out for the evening papers in the hope of seeing it among the articles found. His eye, of course, would alight upon the advertisement. He would be overjoyed. Why should he fear a trap? There would be no reason in his eyes why the finding of the ring should be connected with the murder. He would come. He will come, promised Holmes, and we should see him within an hour. I asked what would happen then, and he said that I could leave it to him, but suggested I should clean and load my old service revolver in case he proved to be a desperate man. I did so and returned to the sitting room to find him scraping his violin and gloating over an answer to his American telegram, which again he would not show me, but which he claimed proved that his view of the case was entirely correct. He then complained that his fiddle would be the better for new strings and told me to put my pistol in my pocket and to act naturally when the fellow arrived, leaving everything to Holmes. The advertisement had said to come between 8 and 9. When we realized it was 8 already, Holmes asked me to open the door slightly and put the key on the inside. As was his nature, he began to talk about something completely different to cover his own excitement. He showed me a book he had picked up at a stall the day before and made some fearful joke about Charles's head still being firm on his shoulders when the little brown-backed volume was struck off. To cover the fact that I was myself far too excited to catch the name of the book, I asked who printed it and missed the answer to that as well, but heard something about a fellow called White whose writing had a legal twist. What does he say here? Published in Latin, 642. This is about that book that they found. Faded ink. 17th century lawyer or something. Then, thank goodness, the doorbell rang. Holmes rose softly and moved his chair toward the door. We heard the servant pass along the hall, and then the sharp click of the door latch. Okay, so here was the paper where the ad was placed and where the article was written. So let's see. It looks like there's the article. Mystery murder in Brixton. In the early hours of this morning, a body was discovered at number 3 Lauriston Gardens on the Brixton Road. It has been identified as that of Mr. Enoch J. Drever, an American visitor from Cleveland, Ohio. Considerable mystery is attached to the case for a number of singular reasons. The constable who made the discovery was drawn to the house by a lighted candle in the room where the body was found, but the house was known to be unoccupied at the time, and no other persons were found on the premises. A quantity of bloodstains lay around the body, but there were no signs of a wound nor any signs of the cause of death. No weapon has been found, and suicide is not suspected. Money found upon the body had not been touched, and the police say that no motive is yet apparent. Letters on the body suggest that the dead man was about to return to America in company with Mr. Joseph Stangerson, for whom the police are now looking with their customary thoroughness. Scotland Yard has already put 2 of its most celebrated detectives on the case, Mr. Gregson and Mr. Lestrade. Sources within the Yard confirm that these 2 men are close colleagues and firm friends, with an enviable record of successful cooperation in a partnership that is an example to their fellow officers. There are rumors that this might prove to be their last case together, but the public can have every confidence that they will swiftly bring it to a satisfactory conclusion through their own unaided efforts. So it's all typical mistakes. They're not friends. They are being aided by Sherlock Holmes, etc. Okay, and now where was the ad in the paper for the ring? Do we think it's going to be one of these ads? How is this guy going to spot such a small little ad? Is this it down here? Oh, let's see. We've got... So look, they put an ad for Stangerson. Mr. Joseph Stangerson, anyone knowing thereabouts of said gentleman, believed to be an American, is requested to contact Mr. Gregson at Scotland Yard. And here's a reward for a gold Albert link chain with oval bloodstone seal. Is this the thing? Is this the chain they found? Jewel robbery. Here's the gold ring. Found in the Brixton Road this morning, a plain gold wedding ring. Found in the roadway between White Hart Tavern and Holland Grove. Applied Dr. Watson, 221B Baker Street between 8 and 9. Okay. We're going to skip reading the rest of these items. So we've got miscellaneous things here, stock markets, parliaments, more personals. Okay, here we go. Continuing this episode. I think what we'll do is we'll read through through March 4th, and then we'll stop before we get to Saturday, March 5th. Friday, 4th March continued. Our visitor took both of us so completely by surprise that I thought it worthwhile to note down exactly what happened as near as I can remember. We heard a clear but rather harsh voice ask whether Dr. Watson lived in the house. Then the door closed as the maid let our visitor in, and someone began to ascend the stairs. The footfall was an uncertain and shuffling one. A look of surprise passed over Holmes' face as he whispered to it come slowly along the passage. There was a feeble tap at the door. I said, "Come in," and instead of a man of violence who we had expected, a very old and wrinkled woman hobbled into the apartment. She appeared to be dazzled by the sudden blaze of light, and after dropping a curtsy, she stood blinking at us with her bleared eyes and fumbling in her pocket with nervous, shaky fingers. I glanced at Holmes, and his face had assumed such a disconsolate expression that it was all I could do to keep from laughing. The old crone drew out an evening paper and pointed at our advertisement. The crone says, "It's this as has brought me, good gentlemen, a gold wedding ring in the Brixton Road. It belongs to my girl Sally, as was married only this time 12 month, which her husband is steward aboard a Union boat, and what he say, if he come home and found her without her ring, is more than I can think, he being short enough at the best of times, but more especially when he has the drink. If it please you, she went to the circus last night along with, and then Watson says, is that her ring? I guess he's showing it to her. The Lord be thanked, Sally will be a glad woman this night. That's the ring. That's the ring. And what may your address be? 13 Duncan Street, Houndsditch. A weary way from here. Holmes says, the Brixton Road does not lie between any circus and Houndsditch. Oh, the gentleman asked me for my address. Sally lives in lodgings at 3 Mayfield Place, Peckham. And your name is? My name is Sawyer. Hers is Dennis, which Tom Dennis married her, and a smart, clean lad, too, as long as he's at sea, and no steward in the company more thought of. But when on shore, what with the women and with the liquor shops. And Watson, obeying a sign from Holmes, here is your ring, Mrs. Sawyer. It clearly belongs to your daughter, and I am glad to be able to restore it to the rightful owner. With many mumbled blessings and protestations of gratitude, the old crone packed it away in her pocket and shuffled off down the stairs. Holmes rushed into his room and returned enveloped in an ulster and cravat, saying that she must be an accomplice and that he was going to follow her and that I should not wait up for him. As if I could have slept. Looking through the window, I could see her walking feebly along the other side, while her pursuer dogged her some little distance behind. You thought my whole theory was Incorrect. And I thought that I would be led to the heart of the mystery. I'd like to see a little more proof that this is really her ring. It was close upon 9 when Holmes set out. I had no idea how long he might be, so I took out my pipe and had another go at the racy adventures of Henry Murger's Vie de Belhomme. I've been struggling a bit lately, but I'm reaching the better bits at last. Also wrote up my notebook, heard the maid and Mrs. Hudson pass by the door to bed. Holmes did not return till close on 12, and I knew at once from his face that he had not been successful. Amusement and chagrin seemed to struggle for the mastery until the former suddenly carried the day and he burst into a hearty laugh, dropped into a chair and said that he wouldn't have the Scotland Yarders know what had happened for the world, for he had chafed them so much himself that they would never let him hear the end of it. And he says, I could afford to laugh because I knew that I would be even with them in the long run. I don't mind telling a story against myself. I asked him to explain what she did. This woman is a scam artist, I think. I asked him to explain what she did. The creature had gone a little way, he said, when she began to limp and show every sign of being footsore. She came to a halt and hailed a four-wheeler which was passing. He managed to be close to her as to hear the address, but he need not have been so anxious, for she sang it out loud enough to be heard at the other side of the street. She said, "Drive to 13 Duncan Street, Houndsnitch," she cried. Thinking that this began to look genuine, and having seen her safely inside, Holmes perched himself behind. Away they rattled, and never drew rein until they reached the street in question. Holmes hopped off before they came to the door and strolled down the street in an easy, lounging way. He saw the cab pull up. The driver jumped down. He says, that's something which every detective should be an expert at. That's an art, jumping on the back of a cab. Holmes saw him open the door and stand expectantly. Nothing came out, though. When Holmes reached him, he was groping about frantically in the empty cab and giving vent to the finest assorted collection of oaths ever Holmes had listened to. There was no sign or traces of the passenger, and Holmes feared it would be some time before he got his fare. On inquiring at number 13, they found that the house belonged to a respectable paperhanger named Keswick, and that no one of the name, either Sawyer or Dennis, had ever been heard of there. I laughed in amazement to think that the tottering, feeble old woman had been able to get out of the cab while it was in motion without either Holmes nor the driver seeing her. But Holmes replied rather sharply that it was they who were the old women to be so taken in. It must have been a young man, he said, and an active one too, beside being an incomparable actor. Old woman be damned. He had seen that he was followed, no doubt, and used this means of giving Holmes the slip. It showed that the man they were after was not alone, but had friends ready to take risks for him. Holmes then said that I looked done up and should turn in, so I did, guessing that he wanted to be left on his own to think over the trick that had been played on him. I left him in front of the smoldering fire, and as I sat in bed scribbling out a few notes, I heard the low, melancholy wailings of his violin, and knew that he was still pondering over the strange problem which he had set himself to unravel. Why do we have more newspaper here? All right. Looks like there's a note about this article. One expects a newspaper to get its dates correct. Tuesday was not the 4th. Brixton mystery, lawless outrage. The public will recognize in the murder of Enoch Drebber in an empty house off Brixton Road early yesterday morning. Another of those lawless outrages that we have sadly come to expect under a liberal administration. Such atrocities arise from the unsettling of the minds in the masses and the consequent weakening of all authority. The deceased was an American gentleman who had been residing for some weeks in the metropolis, where he had been staying at the boarding houses of Madame Charpentier in Torquay Terrace, Camberwell. He was accompanied in his travels by his private secretary, Joseph Stangerson. The two bade adieu to their landlady upon Tuesday the 4th, and departed to Euston Station with the avowed intention of catching the Liverpool express. They were afterwards seen together upon the platform. Nothing more is known of them until Mr. Drebber's body was discovered many miles from Euston. How he came there or how he met his fate are questions which are still involved in mystery. Nothing is known of the whereabouts of the man Stangerson. We are glad to learn that Mr. Lestrade and Mr. Gregson of Scotland Yard are both engaged upon the case, and it is confidently anticipated that these well-known officers will speedily throw light upon the matter. Weird. Okay. So they were staying in this house. We know Stangerson is his secretary. They were due to get on they were taking a train. Euston Station to catch the Liverpool Express, and all of a sudden they're found miles away in this house. How strange. Okay, and then more paper that probably has nothing to do with us, but then what's this? Brixton Mystery. Is this more about our case? Early yesterday morning, the body of Enoch Drebber of Cleveland, Ohio, was discovered by the police in an empty house off the Brixton Road. The motive for this murder is thought to be revenge, and the police are looking for Mr. Joseph Stangerson, believed to be Mr. Drebber's secretary, whom it is thought will be able to throw some light on the mystery. There's no doubt as to the crime being a political one. The despotism and hatred of liberalism which animates the continental governments has had the effect of driving to our shores a number of men who might have made excellent citizens were they not soured by the recollection of all that they have undergone. Among these men, there is a stringent code of honor, any infringement of which is punished by death. Every effort should be made to find the secretary, Stangerson, and to ascertain some particulars of the habits of the deceased. A great step has been gained by the discovery of the address of the house at which he boarded, a result which is entirely due to the acuteness and energy of Mr. Gregson of Scotland Yard. Okay. And that looks like we're now on to Saturday the 5th. And I think this is where we'll stop. 2 hours and 13 minutes. Yeah. I guess it's not 2 hours and 13 minutes for you. It's 4:52 p.m., so almost 2 hours. All right. So part 2 is in the books. Holmes was a little thrown off his game here, but we still do not know what's going on. Rob says you missed one article, Jesse, on the first newspaper page. Okay, let's see. What did we miss? Did we not read this one? Body of Enoch Drebber, an American visitor to London, discovered early yesterday morning in an empty house off Brixton Road, is a sharp reminder of the underlying currents of social disorder that must be kept firmly in check. In the history of the crime, there has seldom been a tragedy which presented stranger features. The German name of the victim, the apparent absence of all other motive than revenge, hinted at by a sinister inscription on the wall, Both point the finger of suspicion at political refugees and revolutionaries. The socialists have many branches in America, and the deceased had no doubt infringed their unwritten laws and been tracked down by them. We are reminded by many dark fears from the past. The Wehrmacht, the secret German courts of the Middle Ages, the sinister Aqua Tofana of the Nelian prisoner Tofana, the notorious Arbonari, the charcoal burners of Italy who laid their plots in the dim forest, the disturbing career of the Marchionese de Brinvilliers, the disruptive forces of primitive man inherent in the Darwinian theory, the provocative principles of Malthus, who would have us control population by force if necessary, the desperate crimes associated with the Ratcliffe Highway murders. The government should not allow any such insidious forces to break loose in this country. We strongly advocate a closer watch over foreigners in England. Yeah, papers are sort of doing their sensational thing. So they're from different papers. This one was the Daily Telegraph. This one was the Standard. Here's the Daily News. It is a strange case, though. And who is this? A man dressed as a woman who came and got the ring. But the most curious thing now is this idea that these two men have left on this train to go to Liverpool and then ended up in this abandoned building. It's so hard to think how that could have happened. All right, well, that's the end of today's session. It's possible that we've got one more session. Either one or two more sessions. I think maybe one more session will do it, but one or two. I am enjoying the story of Watson and Holmes as a pair, as an unlikely friendship, partnership, and getting a little glimpse into Holmes, maybe presented a little more humbly than, or a little more down to earth than Watson would write up in the novels. Okay, so that'll end it here. Reminder, on Tuesday, we'll be playing a Sherlock Holmes consulting detective case where we'll properly be trying to solve it ourselves. This one looks like it's going to wrap up in 2 days. Normally it takes us a little bit longer than that. Maybe we'll play something else this week as well. Thank you for joining me. YouTube says 15 concurrent viewers, 8 likes. Let me know. Well, you'll let me know when we finish with this Dossier system, whether this is a good way for us to spend our Sundays. Joji says, when I remember, where do the data points for the map come from? I guess Watson has annotated that map, but we don't know when or on what basis. Maybe we can take a look at them on the next session. I'll see you next time.